My name is Alara Bryant. I'm 24 years old, and I've spent the last 2 years working in rooms full of people who only see my last name, never my mind. Right now, I'm staring at the exact hangar where everything changed, where my father laughed at me in front of a room of defense engineers like I was a joke. But what none of them knew, what he didn't know, was that I'd already solved the very problem they were still debating. They just hadn't read the data. They hadn't looked at me. They hadn't looked at all. Before I dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Drop your location in the comments below, hit that like button, and if you're new here, subscribe to hear more stories about standing up for yourself when it matters most. Now let me take you back to how this all began. Underscore I still remember the way the metal floor echoed under my boots that morning. Clean, clinical, cold. I was clutching my notes so tightly the paper edges were folding into my palms, but my face wore that calculated calm I'd practiced 1,000 times in front of the bathroom mirror. When I walked into Hangar 12, no one really looked up. It was the usual mess of men in uniform, technical consultants in khakis, and a few contractors hunched over thick cables and blinking schematics. And there he was, Colonel Bryant, my father. He stood with his arms crossed, joking with 2 men from Lockheed, oblivious to the way I hovered just at the edge of the conversation. I didn't know what I expected. A nod, a quiet, good luck. Maybe even a proud smile? But I got nothing. It was the first day I was allowed to offer a solution on record. Not just assist, not just observe, actually present an independent systems override model. I had worked for weeks, triple-checked every algorithm, even built a simulation using my own hardware after hours in my quarters. The missile locking sequence in the new drone units kept throwing off calibration, and their solution had been patch after patch, bandages on a leaking hull. Mine wasn't a patch. It was a structural correction. I knew it. So when the project lead asked for input and I raised my hand, clear voice, calm posture, I watched the room still slightly confused. My father's eyebrow lifted. I walked up to the table, inserted my drive, and displayed the data stream in full simulation. The engineers leaned in. The numbers were clean. The vectors locked perfectly. For a split second, no one said anything. Then he chuckled. My own father. He chuckled like I had just misread a cartoon strip. Cute, he said, turning to the others. She's trying to redesign a lock sequence with AI redundancy, like we're building Star Wars droids out here. The room laughed. I stood still. I didn't know what to do with my hands. I felt like I was 12 again, holding up a science fair ribbon while he joked to his friends that I might be smarter than she looks. Something went silent in me that moment. Not embarrassed. Detached. That was the moment I realized that here, I was still a kid trying to play adult games. Not because I wasn't good enough, but because I wasn't allowed to be seen. I gathered my notes and walked out before the debrief ended. No one followed me. No one asked if I was okay. Not even him. The echo of their laughter stayed in my ears like tinnitus. But by the time I reached my quarters, I had already made my decision. I wouldn't ask again. I wouldn't present anything to them again. I would just fix it, alone if I had to. Because if no one would read my work, maybe I'd force them to see the results instead. Underscore The air in my quarters felt heavier that night, like even the silence was holding its breath. I pulled off my uniform top, threw it over the chair, and let the tension collapse out of my spine. The mirror caught my reflection as I passed it, and I paused. My face was flushed, not from shame, but from this burning, simmering coil inside my chest that I couldn't quite name. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. But most of all, I wanted to make them eat their words, without ever raising my voice. I plugged in my personal system, an old rig I'd built during undergrad, and began importing the simulation again. The override I'd proposed wasn't theoretical. I'd modeled it across every permutation of error code they'd been patching. My algorithm was based on deep node prediction, running 2 micro-redundancies in parallel that allowed the drone's guidance system to self-correct mid-lock in real time. The only reason they hadn't found it is because none of them had bothered to explore non-linear solutions. They were trained for certainty. I was trained for chaos, for possibility, for silence. Hours passed, the base dimmed, and the curfew alarms hummed faintly in the background. I was halfway through rewriting a piece of code that filtered out sensor noise when I noticed a pattern, something strange. It wasn't part of my override, but it had been hiding in the simulation logs like a ghost. A half-second glitch repeating every 34 test runs. Not enough to raise concern, but consistent enough to feel intentional. A delayed relay echo that shouldn't be there. I replayed it again and again. It didn't belong to the system I'd touched, nor did it seem like an error from any of the patches logged by the other engineers. Someone, or something, was hiding a signal. I blinked hard, stood up, and stared out the small window of my quarters. The tarmac outside was quiet, humid, still. Somewhere out there was the hangar. Somewhere in that hangar was a team of men who laughed at me. Somewhere in that team was a father who didn't believe I could possibly know what I was doing. And somewhere buried in that machine was something none of them had seen. I sat back down and started building a second simulation, one that isolated the irregular pattern and ran a mock sequence to trace its origin. It was tedious work, but I'd done harder things. Getting through MIT without my father even showing up to my thesis defense? That was harder. Sitting across from him at family dinners where he bragged about my brother's war record and forgot I existed? That was harder. By 3 a.m., I had isolated the pattern. It was an internal ping from a deprecated failsafe protocol, one that should have been purged in the last firmware upgrade 6 months ago. But it was still there, running like a backdoor. That meant one of two things: either the upgrade hadn't worked properly, or someone had manually preserved it. Either way, it was a vulnerability, one that no one else had even seen. The next morning, I didn't report to Hangar 12. I called in a systems review and requested personal clearance to the secondary sim lab. Technically, I was allowed. It was just that most people didn't bother using that dusty bunker of a room. I liked it for that very reason. It was quiet. No one looked over your shoulder. No one interrupted you with bad jokes and bruised egos. I uploaded both simulations and began documenting the anomaly. If I was right, this wasn't just redundancy issue. It was a possible infiltration point. The base security framework required any suspected breach, even internal, to be documented and submitted. But I couldn't risk doing that through the official channels. Not yet. Not when everyone still thought I was just Colonel Bryant's daughter with an attitude. So I backed everything up to my encrypted drive. The anomaly. The override. The time-stamped logs showing every line of code I had touched, and which ones I hadn't. And then I stared at the screen, knowing full well that whatever I'd just found was bigger than me. I didn't care if they laughed again. Because this time, I was going to make sure they couldn't ignore me. Not after what I was about to uncover. I skipped the mess hall that day. I couldn't sit across from men who cracked jokes about that intern with daddy issues, without my fingers twitching to slam their tray into the table. Instead, I sat at the far corner of the observation platform above the runway, knees tucked up, laptop open on my lap, watching the early drone tests loop overhead. Their clean arcs cut across the sky like scalpel wounds. It was almost beautiful, until I remembered how fragile the entire system underneath them really was. Every few minutes, I replayed the anomaly. It never changed. And with every cycle, my gut told me I was right. This wasn't just legacy code. This was intentional. Someone had preserved it. Someone had made sure that tiny glitch would stay buried where only an obsessive outsider would notice. But why? Bryant. I didn't flinch, though the voice pulled my spine upright. It wasn't my father's. It was Commander Reyes, one of the upper systems leads, older, sharp-eyed, the type who rarely looked twice at junior staff. He stopped beside me, arms folded, watching the drones like he was trying to read their contrails. I heard you pulled sim lab time yesterday. I kept my voice steady. Yes, sir. Working on your lock sequence model again? I hesitated. No, sir. He looked at me then, really looked. What then? I clicked my screen closed. Nothing that would interest the team. His gaze narrowed slightly. For a second, I thought he'd press. But he just nodded once and walked away. It was a small moment, but I didn't miss the way his eyes lingered on my drive as he passed. That night, I changed passwords again. The next 48 hours blurred. I reran simulations. I mapped the anomaly across different units. It was present in exactly 3 of the 6 tested systems. Only those installed within a specific time frame. I dug deeper and found an old deployment record, one that hadn't been digitally signed by anyone on the current roster. Someone had uploaded an altered firmware version and quietly pushed it into a live test cycle. That someone either had higher clearance than anyone was admitting, or they'd faked their way in. I drafted a formal report, but I didn't send it. Instead, I printed it. On real paper. I folded it into a manila envelope, sealed it, and slid it beneath the door of Commander Reyes' office with no name, no signature. Just a label on the front, System Breach, Confirm Source. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning was worse than the last. My father stood at the front of the hangar with that same air of command he wore like a second skin. Engineers clustered around the consoles, prepping for another demo. As I stepped in, I heard the tail end of a joke. Something about civilians playing at cyber warfare. I didn't have to guess who it was about. I moved past them silently and took my usual post behind the secondary screen array, pretending I wasn't watching my father track my every move from the corner of his eye. But something shifted mid-demo. Commander Reyes entered the hangar with someone behind him. The room stilled. You could feel it, the hush of tension that follows brass too high up the ladder. I turned just in time to see a tall man in a grey uniform with no nameplate and no visible rank, but every movement screamed authority. The kind that silences rooms. He said nothing for several minutes. Just watched. Then he turned to Reyes and said, "Where's the override?" Reyes gestured toward me. And the man, this total stranger, walked straight to my console, looked down at my notes, and said, "Show me what you found." No one laughed this time. No one said a word. I opened the drive. Loaded the simulation. My hands were shaking, but my voice wasn't. I walked him through every phase, the override, the breach, the hidden legacy code. He listened. He nodded once. And when I was done, he looked at me and said something no one else had said since I joined the team. "You were right to keep digging." Then he turned around and left without another word. And just like that, everything changed. Understood. I didn't know his name. No one said it. No one even dared to ask. But after that day, the air on base shifted. Quietly. Subtly. The kind of shift you only notice when you've spent your whole life on the edges of rooms, studying tone over words. People still didn't talk to me much, but they stopped laughing. No one mentioned cute ideas, or playing with simulations anymore. I became invisible again, but in a different way. Not dismissed. Watched. That following week, I was granted Level 2 access. It came in an unmarked envelope delivered to my quarters, along with a time-stamped message from Commander Reyes. "Keep working. Don't share." That was it. No explanation. No signature. But I knew exactly what it meant. I dove in deeper. What I had found was only the edge of something much larger. The glitch wasn't just present in drone software. With Level 2 clearance, I now had access to classified satellite comms logs, weapons targeting records, and dormant backup firmware histories. I mapped the pattern, ran correlation models, and my stomach dropped. It had been embedded across 5 different platforms, always quietly, always hiding just beneath normal operational ranges. These weren't coincidences. Someone had engineered a backdoor across the entire system. Worse yet, whoever did it had been careful. So careful it took someone as obsessive as me, someone ignored enough to stay late, someone invisible enough not to trigger protocol alerts, to find it at all. But what really broke me was realizing how close it had come to being missed. If I'd let my father's laughter get to me that day, if I'd walked away, if I'd decided to give up and just ride out the contract like another faceless tech on a clipboard, this vulnerability might have stayed buried until it was activated. Until it cost people their lives. My eyes burned as I stared at the blinking cursor, the simulation replaying again and again. And then the door buzzed. I jumped. No one ever visited me in my quarters. I peeked through the peephole and felt my pulse spike. It was him. The general. He stood there alone, arms crossed behind his back, expression unreadable. I opened the door slowly. "Permission to enter?" he asked, like this was my command post and not a 12 by 12-foot room with a flickering ceiling light and the faint smell of burnt coffee in the air. I nodded, stepping aside. He entered, eyes scanning everything quickly. My cluttered desk, the paper charts taped to the wall, the open circuit board on my bunk, wires trailing like veins. He said nothing for a while. Then he picked up the drive on my desk. "This all of it?" I nodded. "Everything I've found so far." He inserted it into the encrypted tablet strapped to his side, scanned the data with a speed that stunned me, then looked up. "You didn't file an official report." I stiffened. I didn't think anyone would believe me. That made him pause. Then he nodded. "Smart call." He set the drive down, pulled a chair from the corner, and sat like he had all the time in the world. "Tell me what you think this is." I swallowed. "It's a multi-platform embedded access protocol, hidden in legacy code, buried under superficial error logs. It's not a glitch. It's a design. Whoever wrote it knew exactly what they were doing. And it's everywhere. And the purpose? A kill switch," I said quietly. "Or a hijack trigger. Either way, if it's activated, we lose control." He didn't respond right away. Just stared at me, like he was waiting for more. "I don't know who wrote it," I added. "But whoever did had deep clearance. Or faked it well enough to go undetected for months, maybe longer." Finally, he leaned back and nodded. "You have no idea how many people have walked past this exact threat. Brilliant engineers. Generals. Contractors with security clearances so high they forget gravity applies to them too." Then he fixed me with a look so sharp it felt like it split something open in me. "But you saw it. Not because you had to. Not because someone told you. But because you refused to be silenced." He stood. "You're not invisible anymore, Ilara." And then he was gone. He left nothing behind. No orders, no paperwork, not even his name. But his words clung to me like armor. I wasn't invisible anymore. I stood alone on the tarmac that night, my hands tucked into my pockets, watching the lights blink on the edge of the runway like distant stars. The hum of the hangar behind me had long faded. The chaos was over. The audits were complete. The breach was confirmed. Every single vulnerability I had flagged had been patched, sealed, and secured, because of me. Because I kept digging. Because I didn't give up when the world told me to sit down and smile. Because I didn't let a last name define my ceiling. And yet, even after everything, he hadn't said a word. Not until that night. The knock was so quiet, I almost missed it. I opened the door and there he was, Colonel Bryant. No uniform. No command. Just my father, standing in the hallway, holding something in his hand. It was my old notebook. The one I used in undergrad, filled with scribbles, circuit diagrams, and dreams no one had taken seriously back then. He didn't hand it to me. He just looked at it, then at me. "I used to think discipline was enough," he said quietly. "But you You saw what I didn't. And you didn't stop. Even when I didn't make it easy. He looked tired. Not just from the base. From himself. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. He set the notebook down on my desk. I was wrong about you. It wasn't an apology, not really. But it was something. A beginning. And the truth is, I didn't need him to fix what he broke. I'd already done that myself. I walked back to the platform the next morning, laptop in hand, eyes clear. The hangar was quiet, but my presence wasn't ignored anymore. People nodded. Some even smiled. A few asked what I was working on. For the first time, I wasn't just a shadow behind the screen. I was the girl who caught the flaw no one else saw. The one who stayed silent, then saved them all. I used to think being seen meant being praised. Now I know better. Being seen is being doubted, dismissed, pushed aside, and showing up anyway. Because sometimes, the most powerful voice in the room isn't the loudest. It's the one that never stopped speaking truth, even when no one listened. And that's who I am. Ilara Bryant. Engineer. Analyst. Daughter of a man who once laughed. And the woman who made the general stand still.